Okay. Welcome back after I hope you thought was a nice lunch. The purpose of this session is really information giving about how the SCREC and associated colleagues throughout the university work, and to allow opportunities for any questions at the end. So I'm going to give a very brief overview, and then Lindsay will give some rather more practical details about the processes that we adopt. Okay, so within this university we take the definition and the principle that all research projects involving human participants or their personal data or their human tissue must obtain ethics approval before the research commences, which is obviously a key feature. Probably the key thing to get across is what we use as a definition of research in the university here. It does vary slightly across universities across the UK. It's quite difficult to actually obtain the definitions of research from many universities, and we can only really do that by circulating requests for their definitions and looking on websites. What we use is a definition that was taken from the RAE. Now, of course, the REF hasn't changed a great deal, back in 2008. So all investigation undertaken to acquire knowledge and understanding, which includes work of educational value and also administrative research. So it is a very wide-ranging definition, probably slightly more wide-ranging than others. It doesn't, however, include what can be defined as either audit or service evaluation. Again, there are sometimes some queries about what is an audit, what is a service evaluation. Nor does it take into account when you routinely test and analyse materials, components or processes. So if there isn't really a hypothesis to be tested, that's one way of sort of getting some idea of what would and would not be researched. And of course, from the ethics point of view, it's part of doing, as Richard Jones was saying and others this morning, part of doing the best possible research with integrity. And there's a wider integrity agenda throughout this and other universities, but ethics forms a core part of that. And it's about how we should conduct our research from the very beginning, conception and writing, through to the completion. And it's how we treat those involved in or affected by our research. So the principles that we're looking at in the ethics review process is the rights of the participants, and obviously the number one is the informed consent, confidentiality, this goes back to the privacy agenda to some extent, the safety of the participants and the security of the data and samples that are obtained. Of course, certainly in biomedical research, one cannot always guarantee the absolute safety of an individual if you're doing a research project when you don't know what the outcome is. But you need to minimise and inform about those risks if there are any. Researchers' obligations, of course, as we've heard again this morning, of honesty, integrity, minimising the risk as I've just mentioned, and as Richard Jenkins and others mentioned, being aware of the cultural sensitivities of that individual and their culture and their environment. And we need to do all of these thinking processes when we're doing the ethics review procedure for all of those types of research. So in our university, or the University of Sheffield, the University Research Ethics Committee is a single central committee which has ultimate responsibility through to Senate for the conduct of human-based research in the university, other than work that is eligible for an NHS ethics committee. But it doesn't do all the reviewing itself. Some universities take a very centralised approach where right in the heart of the university there's one big committee or several big committees that look at research projects from all different faculties. But in our university, which is one of a handful, we devolve this responsibility through to individual departments, and for reasons that we'll come to in just a moment. But each department, in order to do that, has to have a pool of ethics reviewers that are appropriately trained and have relevant expertise. And the organisation is done through a principal ethics contact and, in most cases, an ethics administrator. So our approach to adopting this devolved model is based on trusting our colleagues to do locally devolved ethics reviewing, but this is balanced by reasonable monitoring of what goes on. This is based on our belief that disciplines know their own fields best, and they're in the best place position, therefore, to do the ethics review of those applications. And the trust in that policy is based on dissemination of good practice guidelines and development of staff to mean that they are capable and developed to do that role. It's also based on the belief that self-regulation results in greater engagement than a top-down regulation. So for it all to be regulated and inculcated through each individual department raises awareness and activities of research ethics review. So involving more people in the ethics review results in a greater awareness. So our key tasks at the SCREC are to promote awareness and the understanding of research ethics throughout the university. Today's event is one example of that. To advise on any research ethics matters that are referred to us from within the university, including wherever there might be some in-clarity or further clarification required of aspects of the research ethics policy, which also we update on a regular basis. As I've mentioned earlier, we need, as the responsible committee, to monitor the procedures adopted by individual departments to make sure they meet the minimum standards that we would expect across the university, and to keep abreast of the external environment to make sure that our processes meet the needs as of 2014, 15, etc. What we don't, as a SCREC, do on a routine basis is ethically review individual applications, because that is not consistent with the devolved model. However, if an applicant has appealed against a decision made within their department, they are at liberty through the ethics policy to refer that up to the SCREC. Or if the department cannot reach a decision because there's disparity between the opinions of reviewers, or because they feel they don't have the expertise. And we also do give advice, as one of our major functions, on ethical issues that cannot be addressed by department, but we don't do that unless it's related to human research in some way or another. So ethics in the general sense, not related to research, is not our responsibility. So one of the key things we do is provide resources. Now, websites are only as valuable as how current and how usable they are, and Lindsay and her colleagues make strenuous efforts to continually refresh our central database, which does mean it gets quite big. So our next challenge, or our continued challenge, is to make sure it's navigable, and it's for you guys to tell us how navigable it is, but we do take feedback on a regular basis. Quite often we get asked, because we're the final port of call, to give opinions on difficult ethical issues alongside in the same way as you've heard about this morning. So when we've done that and come to our decision, we very often write a policy note or put the decisions up on the website so it can assist other people in the future. Because sometimes these are new to us, and therefore we have to use the principles to come up with what we hope is a sensible and pragmatic approach. But if you look there now, until only a few months ago, to find the ethics site you have to go through quite a lot of other sites, but now we have our dedicated web address there, so you go straight to our website if you go to that address. So that's all I want to say on the sort of generalities of the SCREC, and Lindsay's now going to give you some rather more operational guidance.
Okay, so thanks, Chris. So I'm Lindsay Unwin from Research and Innovation Services, and I'm the Secretary to the University Research Ethics Committee. So I wanted to give you, as Chris says, a bit more of an introduction to the sort of practicalities of how the ethics review procedure works. I'm assuming that most people here are interested from the point of view of being applicants, so people who are actually seeking ethics approval. Is that right, or is anyone who's here for another purpose? A reviewer, okay. Oh, from Sheffield Hallam, isn't it? Yes. Okay, well, I think the sort of principles and the things that I'll be outlining will be equally applicable to reviewers, although I'm kind of slightly taking the approach of looking at it from the point of view of an applicant. But there's going to be time for questions afterwards as well. So. Okay, so just to clarify the different ways you can go about getting ethics approval, the ways that you might need to go about getting ethics approval. The university obviously has its own ethics review procedure, which, as Chris mentioned, is administered within each of the academic departments. It may be that if you're doing research that involves another university or that's being done outside of the UK, that you need to seek ethics approval through another organisation. So that's something we call the alternative ethics review procedure, and I'll explain these in a bit more detail in a minute. We do have a specific administrative research ethics procedure. I think most people in the room are on the academic side of things, but just to be aware that the professional services do also, if they're doing research, have to seek ethics approval as well. It's not just the academics. And the NHS, as probably anyone who's involved in any kind of medical type of research, has its own ethics review procedures, which are totally separate from the university ones, and they're required in certain situations, generally where the NHS patients are involved. So just to briefly clarify the remit of when each of those applies, the university's own ethics review procedures apply when we're talking about a research project as defined by Chris earlier, that involves human participants and personal data, where it's being led by this university, where the research is taking place in the UK. And the final point I've added, because that's a fairly recent change in terms of the NHS remit. Until fairly recently, research involving NHS staff or NHS premises had to be reviewed through the NHS's ethics procedures, but that's actually changed now, and so that kind of research can now be reviewed through the university's procedure, which is good news if you want to do that kind of research, because the NHS procedures are quite in-depth and lengthy. The alternative procedure that I mentioned, so this is where if you're doing research which is being conducted outside the UK, or where there's another university leading, or another organisation leading the research. Basically we want to avoid the situation where you might have to seek ethics approval through our process here in Sheffield and another one elsewhere.
Trinity Dublin.
Sorry?
Is that Trinity College Dublin?
It does, yes, I think it is. That's spotted. Yes, we want to avoid a situation where you're having to seek dual ethics approval if possible. So if you're dealing with a collaborator in another university or whatever, and they have an ethics review procedure, then providing that ethics review procedure is robust and sort of broadly equivalent to the one in Sheffield, then you wouldn't need to go through Sheffield's procedure as well. But there is this procedure that just checks, basically, we'd ask you to provide some information, like usually just the application form, the details of who will be conducting the review in the other organisation. That needs to be forwarded through your departmental ethics administrator to my team in RIS, and we then do a quick check just to make sure that that process is kind of covering the broad principles that we would expect, and that it broadly meets the same sort of specifications as the University of Sheffield's process. And if that's the case, then you can go ahead with the approval from the other organisation. I won't go into the administrative procedure too much because I don't think there's anyone here from that side of things. So the NHS procedure, just briefly, you would need to seek ethics approval through the NHS when your research involves patients or users of the NHS, and that's both current or previous if they're being recruited through that, because they are patients or users of the NHS. It also applies to relatives or carers of the NHS patients, data, organs or bodily material of NHS patients, etc. So there is quite comprehensive guidance on this provided by the National Research Ethics Service, or NRES. So if you think your research might fall under those sort of categories, it's probably worth looking at that guidance in more detail. There are various kind of exemptions and things. And just very briefly, if anyone's involved in any kind of social care research, there is now a specific social care research ethics committee, a national one, which has specific kind of expertise on social care and will review certain types of ethics, certain types of social care research which are outlined there. And you apply through the same route as the NHS process through an online system called IRAS. Okay, so the main part of this talk I want to focus on is the university's ethics procedure and how you actually go about applying the sorts of things you need to think about when you're going through the application process. So the application process is slightly different depending on whether you're a staff member or a student, EGR research student, or a taught student. So I'll just cover each of those. Staff, basically, it's a case of finding the relevant ethics application, and the reason that might be an issue is that we have a university standard ethics application, which has been approved by the UREC, but departments are allowed a bit of flexibility in developing that, tailoring it to their own purposes, adding questions, changing the formatting. So you would need to check with your own department as to which, whether they have a specific form. Obviously, with the introduction of this new online system, which was mentioned earlier, that kind of negates that issue, because it'll all, when you select your department within the online system, it will automatically bring up the right version for your department. But if your department's currently using the paper-based system that's been in place for several years, then it's probably worth looking at your departmental website or contacting your ethics administrator, and there's a designated ethics administrator in every department. So it's a case of filling in the application and then submitting it to the ethics administrator. So at the moment, if you're on the paper-based version of the system, it would be submitting that by email generally, although the sort of details of how the process works, again, vary slightly by department. And you can expect to receive a decision within 2 weeks. That's the kind of estimated time frame that we ask departments to try and follow. Obviously, sometimes things do get delayed for various reasons, but that's the estimated, the aimed for time frame. One thing to mention when we're talking about staff is that if you have say a large group of students on a particular module who will all be doing research projects of a very similar nature, or exactly the same nature, then you can actually do what we call a generic application. So you can apply for a single ethics application to cover all of those projects, rather than each student having to do their own separate one. There are kind of criteria for that, but it's all outlined in the ethics policy. So it's quite useful. I think quite a lot of people find that useful in departments where they have large numbers of taught students to get through the process. Postgraduate research students, it's a very, very similar process to staff. The only additional step is that the supervisor needs to sign that off as well, so you would need to just get them to have a look at it and sign it off before submitting it to the ethics administrator. And then when it comes to undergraduate and postgraduate taught students, the process is slightly different. Basically, the supervisor or module leader should help the student find the relevant application and fill it in, and then the student needs to submit that to the supervisor, who then actually has quite an active role in the process, because they decide on the risk level. So again, there's guidance in the ethics policy on what we classify as high and low risk. Some of them were mentioned in one of the talks earlier, and I'll cover it a bit more later as well. And if the project is classified as low risk, then the supervisor themselves can actually do the ethical review effectively and decide whether the application can go ahead or not, or be approved or not. And they should then just inform the ethics administrator for the department of what the decision is. However, if it's classed as high risk, so if there's particularly sensitive topics involved, or if it involves particularly vulnerable people, then the supervisor needs to submit it to the ethics administrator in the department, because it needs to be reviewed by 2 people instead of just the supervisor. There should be at least one other. So usually it would be the supervisor plus one other. Some departments might require 2 independent reviewers, so that depends on the particular department, as long as 2 people are looking at those high risk applications.
Can I ask a question now?
Yeah.
If there are undergraduate students, one person reviews, one reviewer reviewing undergraduate application. If it's postgraduate but high risk, 2 reviewers need to review it.
Yes.
If it's application from staff, 3 reviewers need to review it.
That's right, yes. Yep. Okay, so one key point to mention for all applicants at all levels is to make sure you leave enough time for the process, because even if you submitted and get your response within 2 weeks, the response might say that you need to make some changes and then resubmit it. So you do need to build a bit of time into that, probably minimum of 3 to 4 weeks, I would say, just to allow enough time to revise the application if there are any issues and to resubmit it to the reviewer. So just to clarify what happens when you do submit your application, which just clarifies the point you just made, the ethics administrator, when they receive the application, they identify the appropriate number of reviewers, so they'll select from a pool of people within the department who have signed up and been trained to be ethics reviewers. Staff and postgraduate research projects will be reviewed by 3 people, and they should all be independent people, so the supervisor shouldn't be involved when it's a staff or PGR project. High risk undergraduate or PGT projects should have 2 people reviewing, and if it's a low risk undergraduate or PGT project, it can be just 1, so the supervisor generally. And the reason that there is that disparity is to basically recognises the additional risks posed that are likely to be posed by significant projects being undertaken by staff and research students versus the kind of the sort of research projects that taught students are going to be doing, which are more about learning the research process. And so that's the smaller number of reviewers required basically facilitates the process in departments. So where you've got large numbers of students, the idea is that it helps to speed the process up and make sure that an appropriate level, a proportionate level of ethical review takes place within a appropriate time frame to stop big log jams or anything happening in departments. So when an ethics reviewer is passed an application to review, and it's usually managed by email in departments. I think there are 1 or 2 that do it by committee, as was mentioned earlier, where they actually all sit down in a room and discuss them. But usually it's emailed out to the reviewer, who then has a comments form that they fill in with the decision they've made and any additional sort of comments or requirements that they want to make. They then send that back to the ethics administrator, who appoints one of them as the lead reviewer. So that's the person who then looks at the comments from all of the other reviewers and consolidates that into a single response. So if you've got, we don't want to confuse people by giving 2 very different responses. If there are significantly different responses, then perhaps those reviewers would need to sit down together and come to some kind of agreement. And as Chris mentioned earlier, where there are contentious decisions, people can't come to some agreement, then the UREC might need to step in and have a look at those. But normally the lead reviewer would come up with the sort of consolidated response, and then the ethics administrator would confirm that in writing to the applicant. So sometimes that's done by email, sometimes by letter, depending on the department. But you should get in writing that what the decision is for your application. So that's just a more diagrammatic summary of the review process for taught students. So the low risk process here, where the supervisor reviews it, and then the slightly more in-depth process for the high risk projects, where 2 reviewers are required. And then for PGRs and staff, very similar process for both, but with the additional step for PGRs where the supervisor signs it off before it gets submitted. So what might the decisions be when you submit your application? You might get approved straight away, so you can go ahead with the research straight away. It might be approved with suggested amendments, which again you can go ahead straight away, but it means that the reviewers have made some comments suggesting things you might consider, but you're not required to make any changes. You can just go ahead. Thirdly, you could have approval with compulsory amendments, and this is where you actually have to make the changes that the reviewers require, and then you have to evidence that by resubmitting the application showing whatever it is they've asked you to do. And normally you would resubmit that to the ethics administrator, and they would just get the lead reviewer, hopefully if they're still available, or potentially one of the other reviewers, just to check that the issues have been dealt with satisfactorily before you get your full approval. You could get those suggested and compulsory changes, and then the final one is not approved, which obviously means there are significant issues with it and you need to go back to the drawing board. But I think based on the reports we get annually from departments, it's very rare that anything gets completely kind of thrown out the window, as it were. Okay, so then the final part of this presentation, I really wanted to just talk about the sorts of things you need to think about when you're submitting an application, preparing an application. Some of the key principles to follow. So it's already been mentioned several times this morning about seeking informed consent, making sure your participants are fully informed about what they're going to be asked to do and have given their consent to it. Protecting the participants' confidentiality and anonymity, again that's been discussed this morning. Making sure participants' safety and well-being is being protected and any risks are being thought through. So I've already mentioned briefly about things that might make it particularly high risk and potentially high risk anyway, and might need more detailed ethical consideration. So particularly if you're involving particularly vulnerable people, so there's a list in the ethics policy of exactly what you mean by this, although it's not, I can't say it's a comprehensive list because it could never be comprehensive, but we mean things like young people, under 18s, people who are disabled, people with a mental incapacity, people who are under the protection or kind of under the control of others, so school children perhaps, or prisoners, which I mentioned earlier as well, people who might be sort of under particular stress, so maybe relatives of people who just had suffered an injury or who are very ill, something like that. So people who are vulnerable in some way, and then sensitive topics as well, so things like the research might touch on issues of race, religion, abuse, nudity, the body, anything like that that might potentially distress or upset people. And it might be that the research topic itself doesn't really focus on those things, but that those things might come up in the course of a conversation or an interview or a focus group or something, and therefore need to be considered anyway, just in case they do come up. So then once you've thought about what potential risks are, how will you actually manage them, or what steps can you take to mitigate any risks that the project poses. And then in your application, make sure you provide enough detail for the ethics reviewers to actually make an informed judgment. Because if you don't, then you're much more likely to end up having to go through the process of resubmitting, which is going to take longer and delay your research potentially. So it's better to get sufficient detail in there at the outset and really make sure you've thought about it carefully. And the other thing is to make sure it's in lay language as well, because although the review is generally being done within your department, it may be that some departments are quite diverse. It may be that the person who's reviewing it isn't particularly familiar with your particular type of methodology or whatever, and you need to make sure that it's in a language that anyone could understand. Also, some departments, I believe, use some of the ethics reviewers in departments are actually administrators rather than academic staff. So similarly, you want to avoid any kind of technical language and things like that. And that applies also to anything you're going to be giving to the participants themselves about information sheets or whatever about the research, so that they can understand it. And if your research is focusing on a particular audience, like children, an obvious example, then making sure that the information you're giving to them is appropriate for their age, or it might be language issues, those kinds of things. So Chris has already mentioned some of the key principles. I just wanted to go into a little bit more detail about sort of what you need to think about in terms of those key principles. So maintaining the safety and well-being of the participants is one of the key things to think about. So any potential for them to be harmed or to be distressed or upset through the course of the research, and steps should be taken to minimise those risks. So one thing to do is to make sure that participants are informed about any possibility that what they're being asked to do might upset or distress them, so that they can make an informed judgment about whether they're willing to accept that risk. It could also include things like providing particular help or support after the participation's taken place, so signposting them to helplines, or being able to sit down with a researcher and have a bit of a debrief afterwards to talk through the issues. Some research, I'm talking probably mainly about medical research like clinical trials here, but you might sort of knowingly need to actually cause harm to be able to do the research, but in those kind of cases the harm should be outweighed by the possible benefits to the person. So we might be talking side effects of drugs and things here, but I think that's particularly more applicable to medical type of research. Participants should always be informed about procedures for getting help and support from the researcher or the research team if something arises after they've gone home after the participation and they have a question or some effects which they're worried about. They need to be able to contact somebody. And that's all to do with the safety and well-being of the participants, but you should also think about the safety and the well-being of the researcher as well, or members of the research team who might be going out and doing research for you. So, if you're going out to people's houses, to people's homes, or going out late at night and asking people on the street to do a questionnaire or something, then sort of risk assessment issues like making sure someone knows where you are, making sure you've got a mobile phone on you, those sorts of things need to be thought about as well. Then informed consent, which has been talked about quite a bit this morning already. In general, participants should be fully informed about what they're being asked to do, about the reasons for doing the research and the methodology that's going to be used, and what's going to happen with the data once it's been collected. And they should have a chance to kind of reflect on that information and then ask questions. So the normal route for doing that would be to provide them with an information sheet. So 2 sides of A4 ideally, nothing too lengthy and complicated that they're not going to actually look at it, but providing all the key information about what they're being asked to do and what the effects might be and who they should contact if there's any problems. And we do have on the ethics web pages a guidance document on the sorts of things you should include in that information sheet if that's what you've decided is the best approach. Participants should always be asked to give their free and voluntary consent, so coercion needs to be avoided. A lot of studies, they offer gift vouchers or small amounts of money to try and induce people to participate, and where that's small amounts, that's probably okay. If you're looking at significant amounts of money for participation in a project, and that might induce someone to do something that's perhaps riskier than they would otherwise want to get involved in, then that becomes an ethical issue. So the normal way of getting consent would be to get the participants to fill in a consent form, which usually has a number of tick boxes saying that they sign up to the various aspects of the project. Again, we've got a kind of sample one on the ethics web pages, so you can see the template version. Sometimes there are other ways of getting consent, as was mentioned earlier, about recording it on an audio recorder or some witness oral consent, so it depends on the situation. Participants should always have the right to refuse to participate in the first place, so when they're initially approached, but also to withdraw at any stage. So if they decide halfway through they don't want to continue, then they should be able to leave the project then, and for any data that's been collected at that point to be deleted and not used for the research. One thing it's worth bearing in mind is whether you might want to use the data you're collecting for any secondary analysis for any further projects you might want to do later down the line, because if you can get consent for that at the outset, then that will save you a lot of time when you then come to do the secondary analysis. And if you're planning to do any kind of project where you're proposing not to get informed consent, then you need to be very careful with that. This university isn't risk averse. I think some universities actually kind of refuse to approve anything that's like that, where you're effectively deceiving the people involved, the participants, not fully informing them about what the outcome of the research you're trying to get to and things like that. But this university takes the view that as long as the risks and the issues have been thought through and it's been fully justified, and there's no other way of getting that data that you need other than effectively deceiving the participants in some way, then that can be okay, but obviously it needs to be thought through very carefully. I think that's quite common in psychology, Department of Psychology, and not so common elsewhere. And the final principle I just wanted to go into a bit more detail on, I think, again, this has been covered a little bit already, anonymity, confidentiality and data protection. So any data that's collected needs to be handled in line with the Data Protection Act, and generally participants' identities should not be disclosed unless they've actually agreed to that through a formal consent process. So usually data would be anonymised, and then the data that, the kind of link, the key, if you like, that links the data to the individual should be kept very securely by as few people as possible. So ideally just the lead researcher would have access to that key rather than anyone else. So there's less chance of those links being made and people being able to be identified. And as part of informed consent, these sorts of principles need to be considered as well. So participants should be told about any risk that their confidentiality might not be able to be maintained. And there are potential cases of that if they happen to disclose something of a criminal nature, perhaps. There are certain legal obligations and potentially moral obligations for the researcher to pass that information on to a third party if they become aware of some abuse situation that's going on, or we do actually have a particular policy note which goes into detail on this particular issue, so if you're interested, there's some more guidance on the ethics website about this. Participants should also be informed of who will have access to their data and exactly what's going to be done with it. So, is it going to be used how is it going to be published? How is it going to be disseminated? Is it going to be used in any conferences? All those kinds of things. Is it going to be going on any kind of website? So that's more or less it. But there's just a few key points that I wanted to flag up at the end. This again has come up already. I think that you can't. Each project is different, and the kind of issues that come up, whilst you can follow the key principles, some of the kind of key principles that I've outlined, each project still needs to be considered in a case-by-case basis, and there's never going to be a standard response that you can apply to every standard ethics application that you can apply to every single project. Each one does have individual issues and challenges. And it's not about, the ethics review process isn't about preventing high-risk research, but it's about making sure that the risks are being considered and thought through properly and prepared for, thinking through the ethical challenges. But even if you do think very carefully about your project, it may still encounter challenges as it takes place. You can never kind of think of every possible eventuality. So I guess it's a case of thinking that it's not just a process that stops with the ethics approval. Once you get the ethics approval letter or email through, that's not the end of the ethics process. You need to keep thinking about ethics throughout the project, and if necessary, seeking advice or getting getting guidance on anything you might come across as the project progresses. Research is never going to be an exact science, and neither is the ethics review process. It can be a bit subjective, people have different views on things. But one thing that I think helps as an applicant is to put yourself in the participant's shoes. Think about if you were on the side, if you were a participant in your project, what would you think was the information that you need to know about? What kind of questions might you have? Would you be happy to be involved in this project? So as Chris has said, there's lots of information on the ethics web pages. If you want to contact me or my colleague Peggy Horton in Research and Innovation Services, then feel free to do so, and we can help to point you in the direction of information we might have, or get the UREC to look at a particular issue if you have a particular challenge or issue that you can move across. So that's it. If anyone has any questions, then we'd be happy to.